Hello again, class. We finished up our Age of Jackson lesson during our last lecture, and for the next few weeks we're going to do something a little bit different. We're going to take a little bit different approach. For most of this class we've been going very much in a straight line from point A to point B. And what I mean by that is, we talked about the French and Indian War, which led to taxation without representation, which led to the Boston Tea Party, which led to the Intolerable Acts, which led to Lexington Concord, which led to the Declaration of Independence, etc., etc. All right, we've really been going in very much a date order, all right? Chronological order is the key term for it. And we've just been moving year by year by year throughout this time period. Well, for the next several lessons, we're going to change the way we talk about that. We're going to be basically talking about the same time period. Basically the same time period from the Age of Jackson up to the Civil War, right? The first really half of the 1800s. But instead of talking about these individual events that cause another event and talking about them in order, we're going to talk about various topics and issues. For instance, today we're going to talk about art and literature during this time period. In later lectures, we're going to talk about various religious movements, reform movements. Reform meaning trying to make the world a better place. And yet a different unit here that we'll do in a week or two, we're going to talk about different new technologies, the growing of the economy, things like that. All right, so for the next several weeks, we're going to be really kind of stuck in this same time period, but I'm not going to be talking about a lot of dates, not until we get to Western expansion. We talk about specific dates where America added a bunch of land. For the most part, for the next several lectures, we're really going to be talking about different issues more than the dates. But just know, if I'm not mentioning dates, just understand I'm talking about this general time period from 1820 to 1860, or maybe if you want to go all the way back to 1800 to 1860. It's that time period. Or really the first 50 to 60 years of the 1800s. And today we're going to talk about, like I said, art and literature. So let's talk about some key vocabulary terms you're going to come across in this lecture. One, romanticism. This is an art style that stresses the individual, focuses on imagination, creativity, focuses on emotion. So understand, when I talk about romanticism or romantic movement, we're not talking about, like sending someone a Valentine's Day card or buying someone flowers. We're not talking about that type of romantic. We're talking about a particular style of art that came about in the 17th and 1800s. They're really kind of focused on more the individual, how they felt, and trying to look at things creatively. Next, we're going to talk about another thing we'll talk about is the Hudson River School. These were a group of American painters who painted peaceful, natural landscapes. Next word you need to know is Transcendentalism. I know that's a very long word. I don't expect I'm going to give you a spelling test on it, but you do need to understand that word when you see it. You need to understand, one, how to say it. It's called Transcendentalism. And look, you can probably take an entire philosophy course or art course that talks about Transcendentalism. We're just going to touch very, very briefly on it. But it's a philosophy that the spiritual world is more important than the physical world, and that people can find truth within themselves through their feelings and through their intuition. And the next vocabulary word we'll talk about is civil disobedience. This is nonviolent resistance or protest, where people peacefully refuse to obey the law. Okay. So civil disobedience. Remember, think about, I know most of you have heard about Rosa Parks and the bus boycott there in Alabama in the 1950s. Okay, that's a form of civil disobedience. People very peacefully, but refusing to follow the law that, when they don't think the law is fair. All right, so just be on the lookout for those vocabulary words I'm talking about. All right, so let's talk about art and literature. Remember, going in the 1800s, America, the United States as its own country is, still only 20, 30 years old. All right, and it hadn't really had a time to develop its own artistic style. But in the 19th century, all right, remember the 19th century referred to the 1800s. All right, so when you hear something talk about the century, the 19th century, always remember to subtract one and then put hundreds on it. That's how you know what time period you're talking about. All right, so the 19th century, we're talking about the 1800s. And American writers are influenced by this Romanticism. Remember, that's an art movement stressing the individuals and emotions. Okay? And they drew inspiration from nature and from the American wilderness. Because remember, America, you had a lot more land than you did in Europe. You didn't have quite as many people. You didn't have quite as many big cities. All right, and so, one of the very unique aspects of America at this time period was just how much land and how much nature and wilderness this was. All right, and the first set of American writers, all right, and when I say American, I mean, they lived in the United States. They were from the United States. They weren't British. All right, they weren't people in England writing about America or people from England who just came to America. These were people from America writing about America. And many of them, nature and the wilderness plays a big part. So James Fenwar Cooper writes a series of adventure novels, or a number of adventure novels. His most famous is called The Last of the Mohicans. That was an Indian tribe. A guy named Washington Irving. Now you can probably guess as to who he's named after. All right. So again, we're starting to get this next generation. These aren't the people who fought in the Revolution. These are the people who were born into what was already an existing country. These are the first people that were born American. Before that, you were born British. Right? George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson. They were British when they were born. They were still part of the British Empire. But this next wave of people are born American. The next generation is born as Americans. They grew up in the United States of America. So you can kind of guess who Washington Irving is named after. And he writes a bunch of fantasy and spooky series like Rip Van Winkle. Maybe you've heard of that one. That's the story of the guy who falls asleep for 20 years. And that's kind of said about the Revolution. The guy falls asleep when America's still part of England, and he wakes up, and where there used to be, paintings of King George III up, now there were paintings of George Washington, and he missed the Revolution. And then finally, the Legend of Sleepy Hollow, which you probably know better. It's the story of the Headless Horseman, which you see there on the right, the picture there. All right. And so writers like Washington Irving celebrated America's past. For example, and you don't have to write this example down, but a poet named Henry Wadsworth Longfellow wrote about Paul Revere's ride. And that's what gave us the line, one if by land, two if by sea. So remember we talked when we talked about Lexington and Concord. The system that Paul Revere and the Sons of Liberty and the Minutemen came up with, where you'd put one lantern in the Old North Church steeple if the British were attacking by land, and two lanterns if they were attacking by sea. Well, a lot of people were on this, in the Sons of Liberty and the Minutemen. But Paul Revere ended up becoming much more famous than the rest of them who were on that safety committee because of this point. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, writing basically 70 or 80 years after the fact, makes Paul Revere the center of the poem. That's why Paul Revere is so famous today. But these American writers who were born in the very late 17 or early 1800s kind of wrote about the revolution and celebrated it, celebrated America's past. Then you had this fellow, Noah Webster. All right, he was a teacher, he was a lawyer, and he published, and look at the title of that, The American Dictionary of the English Language. Right? So this used American spellings of words and include American slang. All right, so in case you didn't know, yes, we in America here speak English just like they do over in England, but in many instances, Americans spell the same word differently here than in England. All right? For instance, we may spell color C-O-L-O-R, whereas in England for a long time they spelled it C-O-L-O-U-R. They'd add a U. When we're talking about defense, when we write defense, Americans spell it with an S. The British write it, and the English spell it with a C. All right? So those are types of differences. And so Noah Webster was the first guy who came along and said, look, we're America, we're our own country. We have our own traditions, we have our own habits, and yes, we speak English, but we have our own style and characteristics of it. Right? So he wrote an American-based dictionary. And then you had this group of romantic painters. And again, I'm talking about romanticism. I'm talking about, yes, they're trying to evoke emotions and looking at creativity, but it's not necessarily, one person falling in love with someone else. Not that type of romantic, but in this style. And we call them the Hudson River School of Painting because a lot of their studios were along the Hudson River in New York City. But they started to develop a somewhat unique American style of painting. And a lot of times they focused on painting landscapes. Because remember, that was one of the things that made America unique, this vast amount of land. And certainly compared to Europe, America has, these, like if you go out west to the Rocky Mountains, these are huge, giant mountains that most of the people in Europe had never seen this before. Most of the people in America had never seen these before. It took a long time in a covered wagon to go from, say, New York to the Rocky Mountains. But some of these painters did. And they came back with these paintings of the American West. And this really awed people. Right? It was flabbergasting. Because think about it, most people then, were born, lived, worked, and died all within probably about 20 miles. All right, they didn't really travel. You didn't have cars or planes, and we're talking about the early 1800s. You didn't even have trains. All right, and so most people never left kind of the city where they were born. All right, and so if you were living in Boston, you'd be used to the crowded streets of a city. You may be used to the coastline there along the Atlantic Ocean, but you know what mountains were. I mean, you might have heard of them. You probably knew what the word meant, but you'd never seen them. You'd never seen trees that were maybe 100 feet tall, like you have out west. So these Hudson River School paintings really kind of open up America's eyes as to how vast this land was and how beautiful and how different it was in certain places. And probably not, and perhaps coincidentally, perhaps not coincidentally, a lot of people later in the 18th century started in huge numbers moving out west. Then you had a guy named John James Audubon. He traveled throughout the country drawing birds and animals. Because remember, most people didn't get outside of their region, so they knew what birds and animals that lived around that geographic area. But when you go across all of North America, there's many different types of animals and birds in different locations. And so Audubon, kind of taught the eastern part of the country the different types of wildlife that existed in other parts of the country. Right? Now, we tend to focus on these famous people, John James Audubon, Albert Burtsat, but understand that even slaves were creating artwork, making baskets, quilts, and pottery. Now, unfortunately, they don't always get credit for their work, all right, because they weren't allowed to just live as an artist. And so we typically don't know who made what necessarily, but we do know slaves were making various types of art. And we do know that one slave named David Drake, he signed his pottery that he was making in a South Carolina factory. All right, so some of this art by slaves survived and can be attributed, but unfortunately most of it can't. But that doesn't mean we should forget about it. Even though we don't know the specific name of the person who made these art, we do need to recognize that slaves, even though they were being held in slaves, when they got the opportunity, they did create art also in various forms. All right, so here are just some pictures on the left. That's Albert Burdstadt. That's his painting of Yosemite Valley in California. And understand, look how huge those mountains and cliffs are. And most of the people living in the East would have no idea something like this existed until you see a painting like this. They'd have no way to imagine it. Remember, you didn't have TV or internet or things like that. Today, we can look up images and pictures from all over the world anytime we want. But that wasn't true in the 1800s. Most people had no idea what most of the rest of the world looked like. But Burdstadt and these Hudson River school painters changed that a little bit. And then on the right, you just have some famous illustrations and paintings from Audubon of the heron, of the American flamingo. And so writers during this time period started to encouraging pride in American culture. Again, sort of like, remember we talked about having its own dictionary. We talked about these paintings of showing the beautiful American landscape. And so writers and artists and philosophers at the time started to recognize, hey, America should take pride in its culture. All right, Europe's over there thinking, oh, well, we've had culture for hundreds of years, and they look down on America as just sort of this wilderness. But here in the 1800s, this idea started, at least within America, started changing. Like, no, we have our own culture. We have our own art. Right? So this New England writer, Ralph Waldo Emerson, encouraged American pride. Right? And Emerson believed that people should learn about life from self-examination and nature. Right? He basically believed people should go out in nature and think about the world, think about themselves. And then one of his friends, someone who thought a lot like him, this guy named Henry David Thoreau, sort of does something like that. He moves to a cabin. It happened to be on Emerson's property, I believe. He moves to this cabin near Walden Pond in Massachusetts. All right, so this would have been fairly close to Boston. And Thoreau wrote about living in the woods in this very famous book called Walden. And Emerson and Thoreau both belonged to a philosophy called Transcendentalism. Right? So this is one of the words we talked about in the first of our lecture. And Transcendentalism is this philosophy, this theory that the spiritual, or you should focus on the spiritual world and on finding truth through feeling and intuition. Right? So again, it's not necessarily, you should have. It's going against this idea that you should have some authority figure or king tell you, what's true and how you should think and feel. Like Emerson Thoreau folks know you should think about the spiritual world and what are your feelings and intuition that should lead you to the truth on the issue. And Henry David Thoreau is famous for for another famous book. I know I use the word famous in that sentence, probably too much, but he wrote this book called Civil Disobedience, and it's about following one's conscience and not obeying laws that were unjust. Right? And so this idea of civil disobedience, this is also known as nonviolent resistance. It's a type of peaceful protest. For example, in the mid-1840s, Thoreau refused to pay his taxes, and even briefly, although I think only for like one night, went to jail because he objected to the Mexican-American War. Right? He didn't think American should have gone to war with Mexico over Texas and ultimately over most of the Southwest, which America is going to take from Mexico at the end of the war. Thoreau didn't think this was a fair war and that this is a war America should be fighting, and he didn't want his tax dollars to be spent on war. So he simply refused to pay them. And he ended up going to jail for them until someone, we don't know who, a person remained anonymous, ended up paying Thoreau's fine for him so he could get out of jail. But this was an early example of civil disobedience. Someone in America, well, actually, I'm sorry, I said it's an early example. Of course, we've seen examples like the Boston Tea Party and Sons of Liberty and the protesting and, when they were burning the paper for the Stamp Act. We've seen various forms of civil disobedience, some peaceful, some not so peaceful. Back when Britain was in charge of the colonies. And this is the latest example. This is more of an example of an American being civil disobedient to the American government. And Thoreau writes a very famous book on this subject called Civil Disobedience. And so you see these artists who were born and grew up after the Revolution are really focusing on what it is to be an American, sort of America's philosophy, America's spirit. Okay? And so other famous authors and books of this time period include Walt Whitman. He wrote this famous book of poetry called Leaves of Grass. Emily Dickinson is another famous poet from the 19th century. Edgar Allan Poe wrote horror stories and wrote a lot of ghost and horror stories back in the 1800s. Nathaniel Hawthorne wrote The Scarlet Letter. I don't know if you'll end up reading that in high school. I know I had to read it in high school, but it's a very famous novel of this time period. And finally, perhaps the most famous novel from America in the early 1800s is Moby Dick, about a group of sailors who go and try to capture this giant, or not capture, but kill this giant white whale. All right, and so these are the famous pieces of art that focused on Americans and what it was like to be American. And really kind of broke away from the culture tradition from Europe. All right, next time we'll talk about reform movements of the area, and we'll start with these vocabularies.